What's the video game equivalent of a rough sketch? In painting, you start with pencil lines to figure out a composition before you ever commit to shading or colour. In music, you might begin with a single stem, a bass line or drum pattern you can build a song around, or throw away entirely without losing much. They're fast, low cost, and disposable by design, not unfinished versions of the final work, but a different mode of thinking entirely. With a sketch, you're not trying to make something good yet, but figuring out whether there's anything worth making at all. So what does that look like in video games? It's an odd question because games feel so fundamentally different. There's too much to consider: mechanics, systems, player inputs, feedback loops. The idea of reducing all that down to something like a rough sketch feels almost contradictory. A game that's too simple to play stops feeling like a game at all. But maybe the question isn't really about simplicity, but constraint. What happens when you shrink an idea down to its bare essentials, not to make a lesser work, but to test whether the idea is really there in the first place? That's something I think about a lot when it comes to one of my favourite platforms, the Pico 8. Made by Lexalofa Games, Pico 8 is a fantasy console, not a real machine, but a self-contained platform for making games, complete with its own programming language and built-in tools for graphics and sound. It's built around the limitations of older portable hardware, with a strong Game Boy Color era flavour, but reimagined for the present. You can run it in a browser, on your phone, or on all sorts of handheld emulation devices. It's more accessible than those old machines ever were, not just as a place to play games, but make them too. Limitations are its entire point. Pico 8 has a tiny screen resolution, a fixed 16 colour palette, strict caps on how many sprites and sounds you can use, and its own deliberately stripped back programming language. You simply can't build anything too complicated in it, and that's exactly what makes it such a perfect prototyping environment. Pico 8 is a thriving community of developers making brilliant original games with those constraints, but what fascinates me even more is how often developers use it as a sketchpad for something larger, a way of asking whether an idea still holds up in its simplest form. The most famous example is probably Maddie Makes Games' Celeste. Its original prototype was built in Pico 8 over a single weekend, and the heart of the finished game was established pretty quickly. The tight movements, the wall jumps, the air dash. The idea was strong and clear enough that it could survive the jump from a tiny prototype to a full commercial release, gaining beautiful sprite work and a tender story about self-acceptance along the way. What's especially lovely is that the team included that Pico 8 prototype in the final game as a bonus. You can play the sketch right next to the finished painting, and the fact that they sit so comfortably beside each other tells you just how solid the idea was from the start. But Celeste isn't the only example. In fact, a few games I've covered on this channel before went through that same Pico 8 prototyping phase. Jacob Wolodarski's Slipways is a strategy game about linking planets together into a growing galactic network, which on paper sounds like the sort of thing that could spiral into total complexity. And yet, it was prototyped in Pico 8. Those constraints forced every mechanic to be clear, immediate, and easy to hold in your head. When the full game arrived, richer and more elaborate, it kept that same clarity. Slipways is one of the most player-friendly strategy games I've played, and I don't think that's a coincidence. Its design was already locked in before any of that extra complexity showed up. It's telling that Jacob has prototyped his next game, Solitude, in Pico 8 as well. Clearly, as a sketchpad for ideas, it suits the way he thinks. Then there's Motion Wreck, one of my favourite games from last year. Its central mechanic is built around recording your own movements and then playing them back anywhere in the world. Written out like that, it sounds like the kind of idea that should need a long explanation, or at least a very careful tutorial, but it was prototyped in Pico 8, and that enforced simplicity proved that the idea could stand on its own. Players could understand it, feel it, and start playing with it before a single extra system was piled on top. That's what a good prototype really does, not just prove that the mechanics function, but that the idea itself can come across. Which brings me to what I was actually thinking about when I started drafting this video, a game called Corgi Space. You might know its developer, Adam Atomic, real name Adam Saltzman, as one of the co-founders of Finji, the indie publisher behind Overland, Tunic, and Night in the Woods. Or you might know him from further back as the creator of Cannabolt, the endless runner that more or less defined the genre and sparked a whole wave of mobile games chasing its momentum. He's clearly someone who thinks very seriously about what games are, how they work, and how much of an idea can still communicate even in its smallest possible form. At least that's the impression you get from his excellent interview with the equally excellent channel Dev Dive, which is where I pulled together a lot of this background. That same stripped back small game sensibility that gave rise to Cannonbolt in the Flash era also feels like the driving spirit behind Corgi Space. On the surface, Corgi Space is a collection of small Pico 8 games, but it's not a minigame compilation in the WarioWare sense built around frantic reflexes and 5-second punchlines. Adam instead was partly inspired by UFO 50, that remarkable project built around the idea of 50 complete games from a fictional studio's back catalogue. But where UFO 50 presents games that feel like finished works from a more limited era, Corgi Space is chasing something slightly different. The name is a riff on Donkey Space, a game design term about how much room a player has to make meaningful choices. Corgi Space sits at the opposite end of that spectrum. These are games designed to have the shortest legs possible, hence Corgi. Each one introduces an idea, pushes it as far as it can meaningfully go, and then ends minutes to an hour later. No bloat, no overstaying its welcome. It's a sketchbook basically, not because the games feel unfinished, but because they're honest about their scale. Like the best sketchbooks, it even includes little written notes that dig further into the ideas behind them. In a nice touch, you only unlock the developer commentary after playing each game for yourself once. It reminded me a little of the Talking Heads' concert film Stop Making Sense, which holds back audience reaction until the very end, as if to keep your attention fixed on the performance itself. Here it creates a similar effect. Adam seems to want you to form your own thoughts about each game before he adds any extra context. I didn't love every game in Corgi Space, and I think that's exactly how it should be. A sketchbook isn't meant to be wall-to-wall masterpieces. Some pages work, some don't, and the ones that do land often hit harder because they're surrounded by ideas still being worked through. I'm not going to cover every game here, partly because discovering which ones you personally click with feels like part of that appeal. So instead I'll focus on the ones I gelled with. One of them is a Tetris-like puzzle game about fitting cargo into the hold of a spaceship. That might sound slight at first, but it ends up having a really satisfying spatial logic to it. At first it plays on your basic block puzzle instincts, but then it starts teasing out something more through the choices it gives you. Do you spend your money to make the game easier, expand your cargo hold to push for a higher score, or stay frugal and keep the challenge intact? What I like is that it doesn't turn into an endless endurance test where the game just grinds away at your skills. Instead it uses that spacefaring setup to give the whole thing a more defined shape. 8 planets, 8 rounds, 1 run to score as highly as possible. I didn't think much about that while playing, but looking back I'm struck by how purposefully it's designed. The simplicity of the premise makes every decision stand out. Even the stark black backdrop of space feels meaningful, like a smart way of keeping the focus on the puzzle rather than spending precious development time on unnecessary detail. My absolute favourite game out of Corgi Space does something similar. Vampire vs Pope Army. It's a top-down stealth game with hints of early Metal Gear and Wolfenstein, where you play as Dracula, sneaking through corridors and drinking the blood of popes to keep your energy up as part of the movement system. Before I even read the notes, I already liked the idea of it as a stealth action game where every element had to communicate itself as clearly as possible. The popes, reduced to tiny little pope hats, felt like a very funny but also very practical solution to making enemies instantly readable, and that clarity runs through the whole thing. As a vampire, you have to avoid patches of light spilling through the windows, along with a glow of crucifixes and the presence of garlic. Everything is simple, but everything reads immediately. What I really love is how that simplicity turns something like a Metal Gear into almost a puzzle game. Because the popes don't move, and because your steadily growing health lets you push one step further through dangerous light each time, there's basically a single golden path through the whole thing. The challenge isn't so much reacting under pressure as it is working that path out. It's a funny premise, but it commits to it so completely that it becomes irresistible. I had more fun with it in half an hour than I had with plenty of games 10 times its size. Like the best Corgi Space entries, Vampire vs Pope Army introduces this idea, lets you feel clever for understanding it, and then ends before it has any chance to wear out its welcome. That said, much like Celeste, Slipways and Motion Wreck, it's also the kind of thing I'd love to see expanded into something bigger, even if only to the scale of a Game Boy Advance game. We're living through an era of video game gigantism. The prestige release is the open world with 100 hours of content, and the sequel has to be bigger than the last one. More systems, more story, more of everything. So much of the conversation around games now is shaped by scale rather than how well it delivers on what it's actually trying to do. Big games can represent enormous ambition, craft and technical achievement, but I do think we've started to mistake size for value and complexity for depth. What Pico 8 offers developers and what Corgi Space offers players is a reminder that an idea doesn't have to be big to feel complete. Constraint can be generative rather than limiting, and knowing what your game actually is, at its most essential, strips of everything that isn't load-bearing, is one of the hardest and most valuable things a designer can do. The rough sketch isn't a lesser version of the painting, it's proof that the painting is worth making at all, and maybe we need more games willing to be exactly that, small but completely certain of what they are, like a proud Pembrokeshire corgi.